Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I want to associate myself with the comments that Congressman Ross just made, because I have a similar view on asset managers, but I don't want to take up time to talk about that. And when I walked in, I thought I heard my colleague asking you about the prioritization of our debts, but I might not have heard that, and I know you weren't able to answer it, so I do want to make a comment on that. It seems to me that's a really misguided idea, because the best credits in the world, which obviously we should view the United States as certainly one of them, never prioritize their debts, right? Berkshire Hathaway, ExxonMobil, all these terrific credits, all their debts are treated the same, and they have great flexibility as a result. Whereas weak credits are forced by the market to prioritize their debts so that people know exactly what they have and when they get it paid. So it strikes me it would be a really misguided idea to force the United States government into a position where we're somehow signaling to the world that we're a weak credit. I don't know if you agree with that. Very quickly, if you don't mind.
I couldn't agree more. I think that the reality is the technical question of could you pay principal and interest misses the point, which is that if you pick and choose what you pay, you're going to default on something.
And you're going to present very differently than the way we want the United States to.
Even if you reach the conclusion that you had to do that because it would be disastrous not to, it's a terrible place to be because you're still in default.
Right.
So the only thing that solves the issue is to raise the debt limit.
So the second question is about the liquidity crisis, and I know you've talked about this a lot. And it's interesting when you think about the role of banks, which have been very important to our economy for a long period of time, which is why the government has supported them, which is why we also try to regulate them in ways that make sense. Right now, banks are not all that important when markets are good. There's a lot of other alternatives for liquidity. But they're really, really important when markets are bad, because there's no incentive for market-based participants to really participate in markets when they're bad, other than if they're kind of vulture investors and trying to get really good deals. And I do worry that what's happened with liquidity has put these banks in a position that if there were some kind of a crisis, they wouldn't be able to respond as well. And I know there's a lot of reasons why this liquidity data is emerging, but it seems to me, and this is coming from someone who's supportive of the regulatory response that we've had, supportive of Dodd-Frank. I think all the things we obviously had to do. But it seems to me the notion of having very high minimum liquidity standards for banks, coupled with not looking at risk-weighted assets from a capital test and having this kind of overlay where you still risk-weight assets, but you need a minimum amount of capital, which inevitably puts a lot of capital against really low risk-weight assets like Treasuries. It seems to me those create very big incentives for banks not to be liquidity providers in a crisis. Do you agree with that assessment?
I think that the liquidity rules, the theory behind them was you look at the overall exposure of the firm, and they didn't make distinctions between different kinds of assets. I obviously think that Treasuries and cash have a degree of safety that's different than almost any other asset in the world. But that's a different approach than saying everything is treated the same.
Would you support changes to the regulatory framework that actually eliminated disincentives for institutions to hold Treasuries and cash so that they're actually in a position to do their job in a crisis?
I don't think we have any evidence that they're not in a position to do their job. The Treasury markets remain deep and liquid, and as I've said a couple of times today, I don't think that what people looked at on October 15th in terms of the movement on Treasuries had to do with a lack of it wasn't the effect of any kind of regulatory environment.
But the people running these institutions seem to think they have a disincentive to hold liquidity in cash.
Yeah.
So sometimes perception becomes reality.
I'll give you an example. I've heard a lot of them say, as if it affects the Treasury market, that Volcker is the reason. But
well, that has nothing to do with it.
Volcker doesn't cover Treasuries.
I agree. I'm talking about Treasuries.
Yeah, so in Treasuries, I think you asked the right question. Is it something in the leverage rules? Because the other rules didn't
Because it used to be, no matter how many Treasuries you had, you didn't have to have really capital against them. Now you kind of do. So that, in my mind, if I was running an institution, that would make me have less of them.
Right. I think that it is very important for us to maintain the deep and liquid Treasury markets. It is something that is part of what makes our dollar the world's reserve currency. It's part of what is our economic backbone. I don't see a weakness in the Treasury market right now, but I can assure you that a day doesn't go by when I don't ask questions about it.
Last question, XM Bank. I've talked about ideas where institutions like XM are required to sell off some of their portfolio on a regular basis so there's better transparency as to how their assets are priced. Do you support approaches like that?
I'm not familiar with that proposal. I'd be happy to look at it. I think the Ex-Im Bank does enormously important work in leveling the playing field for U.S. exporters. It throws off a
Right,
profit.
and I agree with that position.
Yeah.
I just think additional transparency around how they price their assets is useful.
I just haven't
for
looked at
everyone.
that. I'd be happy to
Got
look
it.
at it.